Shadows of the Lagoon. Prologue, a fisherman's letter, from a letter by fisherman Giacomo Vecchio, 1564. The water keeps rising. They say it's just the tide, but at night I hear singing in the wells beneath the palazzo. They say, the Lord of Shadows sleeps in the lagoon, he who feeds on the flesh of the drowned, and those who remain nameless. They say the Doge's palace took more than 100 years to build piles driven into the clay bottom by the hands of slaves and convicts. Through those years, thousands of souls came to rest beneath the stones, those swept away by storms, or those who vanished into the marshes without a cross. Thus they paid Venice for stone that would not sink. I have seen them at night, when I go to my nets, shadows without faces, wearing the long masks of plague doctors. They whisper to me from below, calling me to follow. I will no longer go to sea. May Saint Mark and those who come after me forgive me. Giacomo Vecchio. Honeymoon. Silver anniversary in Venice. Clara and Marco weren't traveling to Venice for boisterous merriment. Behind them lay 25 years of shared life. A silver anniversary they wanted to celebrate away from the hustle and bustle, in a place where time slowed its pace. The city on water seemed the perfect refuge, romantic, quiet, steeped in history. Marco had collected old canal maps and clippings about plague doctors since childhood. Even at home, he would read strange stories about beaked masks that concealed the faces of the dead. Clara laughed at his fascination, but eventually she too opened books about carnival, custom history, and mask symbolism. Before their vacation, she even had a dream about Venice. Faceless people walked on water, carrying lanterns, while shadows lurked beneath the surface. Their choice fell on an old hotel on a remote island in the lagoon, away from bridges and noisy gondolas, closer to the damp silence of water. "Look, this is perfect," Clara exclaimed, showing Marco the brochure. They found a small, charming hotel on one of the secluded islands in the lagoon, away from the noisy tourist routes, but with a beautiful view of Venice. This promised exactly the seclusion they craved, allowing them to escape the street festivities and noise so they wouldn't hear it in the evening. The hotel was old, smelling of sea and dust. When Clara was unpacking, her hand caught on a decorative panel under the table. Behind it lay an old engraving, a faded sheet of paper on which boats on black water had been carved. In the center stood a figure in a plague doctor's mask, the beak of the mask glowing as if it held a lantern. Beneath the boats were semicircles of mouths or eyes, carved so they seemed to writhe. "Strange," said Marco, sitting down beside her. "I've never seen such rituals in carnival engravings. This is clearly something local. Do you see those mouths, or are they eyes?" Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Maybe it's a legend? An ancient ritual? They hid the engraving back, but the image stuck in her memory. The souvenir. The next day, walking through empty alleyways, they entered a small antique shop. The old owner slept behind the counter, among dusty masks, lanterns, and porcelain angels. Clara noticed a strange figurine. A man in a plague doctor's mask held a small lamp, while waves and eyeless muzzles crawled from the carved base beneath his feet. "That's him," she whispered to Marco, "just like in the engraving." Marco took the figurine in his hands. It was heavy and cold. "They say plague doctors didn't just heal," he said suddenly. "Some brought offerings to the water at night so it wouldn't rise and wash the city away. He didn't want to leave it on the shelf. The figurine settled into their luggage like a stone. First night, otherworldly journey in the lagoon. They were met by Giovanni, a gondolier not old, but energetic and sociable, who immediately endeared himself to them. Giovanni readily agreed to a night trip beyond the island to the wilder and quieter parts of the lagoon, promising the most unforgettable view of stars and silence you'll rarely find in the heart of Venice. He joked, casually sang traditional Venetian songs, seemingly genuinely enjoying his work. "Here is the real Venice," he said, and suddenly added more quietly, almost in a whisper. "Here is Venice without masks, only water and shadows." Marco chuckled. "And at night?" "At night the water whispers. If you want, I'll show you where the stars drown in the lagoon." Giovanni's gondola glided over the dark water, carrying Clara and Marco away from the sparse lights of their island and the distant, barely glimmering reflections of Venice. City sounds gradually faded, replaced only by the splash of water and the rhythmic creak of oarlocks. They emerged into the open lagoon, where almost complete darkness reigned. Around them were only black silhouettes of small islands overgrown with reeds and abandoned moorings. Giovanni continued humming, his voice echoing in the night silence. But then Clara and Marco began hearing other sounds, unexpected, viscous splashes far ahead, unclear, low rumbles. At first, these seemed like songs or music from a distant embankment, echoes of the city's nightlife. But soon it became clear that these sounds weren't quite human, and they were too distant and drawn out to be ordinary music. They would swell and fade, as if something large moved beneath the water, making strange, rhythmic sounds. "What is that, Giovanni?" asked Clara, feeling goosebumps run along her arms. "The lagoon is large, Signora. Many things live here. The wind plays tricks," the gondolier replied, but his smile became slightly strained, his gaze fixed on the darkness. Then Marco noticed them dim, phosphorescent glows beneath the water that moved slowly, like burning yellow eyes watching from the depths. When they pointed this out to Giovanni, he nodded silently, his face pale in the moonlight. Sometimes unclear silhouettes flickered in the distance, seeming too large for people but too strange for animals. Something quickly dove underwater at their approach, leaving only ripples on the surface. By dawn, they returned to their island, exhausted but full of strange, inexplicable impressions. Giovanni, cheerful at the start of the trip, was now noticeably more silent and pale. Clara and Marco walked along the wooden pier to their hotel, feeling the water whisper behind them. They tried to attribute what they'd seen to fatigue, the magic of nighttime Venice, and wild imagination, but anxiety had already settled in their hearts. Days of horror, rising water and growing fear. The next day began an unusually strong acqua alta for this time of year. Water levels in canals and squares constantly rose, flooding the streets. Their island became increasingly isolated, while a gloomy atmosphere spread throughout Venice. The air became damper, heavier smelling of rotten fish and rusty iron. In the morning, they saw the first body floating in one of the canals near their hotel. It was a young tourist, but his body was torn not as if it were an accident or ordinary crime. The wounds were deep, ragged, unnatural, as if he'd been mauled or disemboweled by something enormous. Police and carabinieri bustled about, trying to blame it on a strange shark attack or boat accident, which in Venice was absurd in itself. The next day, another body or two, floating in different but nearby canals, all with the same ghastly, inexplicable wounds. Panic began to grow among locals, but authorities tried to hide it. Clara and Marco observed from the sidelines, feeling mounting horror. They began to notice that local residents, especially the elderly, looked frightened and superstitious. They tried not to leave home in the evenings. Many gondoliers, including Giovanni, refused even evening trips, let alone nighttime ones. Some canals were blocked off or patrolled by police, but this didn't stop new discoveries. The smell from the water became more acrid, stagnant, fishy, especially as water levels rose. Sometimes, at dusk or night, they again saw dim yellow glows in the depths of canals, now closer to their island. Unclear, low rumbles and strange splashes could be heard coming from beneath the hotel windows. Clara and Marco tried to convince themselves it was just coincidence, that everything had a rational explanation. But their anxiety grew with each hour. Marco tried to find logical explanations, but Clara felt an intuitive, sticky horror that penetrated every cell of her body. Finale. Escape through the flooded city. By the end of several days, when water levels reached their peak and the number of bodies found increased to a frightening figure, they realized they couldn't stay any longer. Panic was mounting. When water reached waist deep in the streets and the smell became so heavy it made them nauseous with every breath, they decided to leave. The high water almost completely flooded Venice's narrow streets, turning them into shallow canals. Reaching the central part of the city became much more difficult, and from there to the train station seemed almost impossible. They barely managed to find a boatman, a pale boy who agreed to take them to the mainland part of Venice, from where they could reach the station. He was pale and taciturn, his face expressing mortal fatigue and fear. When they found themselves in a labyrinth of flooded streets where water reached their waists and they had to walk on foot, dragging suitcases, it happened. They were making their way through a narrow, dark alley where the water was particularly murky and high. Up ahead came a short, gurgling cry, then a heavy, squelching sound, as if something enormous and wet was crawling from the water. In the dim light of a rare street lamp, Clara and Marco saw a dark, hunched silhouette dragging through the water, something shapeless, like a wet sack of meat that had recently been human. The creature made a low, guttural growl. Its eyes burned yellow in the darkness, and its body was covered with something like slippery scales. It moved with ghastly, unnatural smoothness, submerging its victim into the murky depths. Then it itself slid into the water, dissolving into the murky black lagoon. Clara cried out, but Marco quickly covered her mouth. They froze, pressed against the wall, not daring to move until the monster disappeared into the canal waters, leaving behind only slowly spreading circles and a horrifying, putrid smell. Hearts pounded in their temples. They ran without choosing their path through flooded streets, past closed shops and empty palazzos, until finally they reached the station. It was packed with frightened tourists and locals trying to leave the city. They miraculously caught the last train that was about to depart. When the cars shuddered and began moving away, Clara looked at Marco. He was gripping their small figurines so tightly his knuckles had gone white. They left Venice, but the horror remained with them forever. The news later spoke of a series of tragic incidents and a strange killer, but Clara and Marco knew the truth. They had seen the eyes. They had felt the smell. They had heard the sounds. They had seen how the others emerged from the depths. Venice, with its canals and the lagoon, kept their ancient, bloody secrets, which only rarely rose to the surface to claim their tribute, forever imprinting themselves on the consciousness of those who became unwilling witnesses.